You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
That makes me Bill Thomas.
And we are so glad you can join us for another episode. Thank everybody so much for all of the wonderful ratings and reviews that we've been getting. I promised Bill the opportunity to do a couple of dramatic readings.
But not too dramatic?
Not too dramatic. We're trying to walk the line here.
All right. All right. Yeah, we do cover serious issues, but we're in different places. Kristin in Virginia, me in Connecticut, and we can see each other, you know. But every once in a while, I'll try to see if I can make her laugh in a less serious moment of the podcast. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Oh, so
generally it works though.
Okay,
yeah.
Dramatic reading, but not too dramatic. Thanks, everybody. Here's a sampling of some recent reviews, and we really do appreciate this. Favorite podcast, 5 stars. Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley are the dynamic duo of true crime. That's pretty good.
That was awesome.
Yeah, I thought so. Truly enjoy the podcast and the banter between hosts. Oh, okay. We'll work on that. Very enjoyable voices and well-researched. Thank you. Guests bring valuable information on assorted topics. My personal favorite, DNA and the value of donating to the databases for law enforcement. Well, that's a pretty cool one to bring up, actually. That's from Lynn.
And we do have some more information to share in upcoming weeks about a partnership that we have with Authoram Labs that's going to get a whole lot more into DNA and the value of donating your DNA to databases. So stay tuned on that.
Elaine writes, good research and interviews, 4 stars. Enjoy the podcast very much.
Thank you, Elaine. We appreciate that.
Well, thank you. And then there's one more over here. Chris writes, these podcasts with Colleen, Fitzpatrick she means, are so informative, and I like the way she explains the process. And we do too, by the way. I also love her dry humor. Kristin Dilley and Bill Thomas's questions are excellent and help bring forth important answers from Colleen. Great teamwork, everyone. Well, thanks, Chris. That's very nice.
Thank you to everybody who has taken the time to leave ratings and reviews. We are going to continue to ask for them because it's the best way to help us grow our podcast. So if you haven't had a chance to leave us a 5-starred review, please do so on the podcast platform of your choice.
And speaking of Colleen Fitzpatrick, in other true crime news, a story broke today that authorities have identified a victim and a suspect in a 1968 Huntington Beach, California rape and murder. A young woman named Anita Pitot was identified a couple of months ago. She was found raped and murdered in Huntington Beach in a field. That's a beautiful area south of Los Angeles, big surfing community in Orange County. This young woman had moved out to L.A. to try to break into the movie business, and sadly, she was raped and murdered. It's been 52 years since this case originally took place. Investigators from Orange County recently hired Colleen Fitzpatrick and her company, Identifinders. This is another one of those amazing forensic genealogy stories. In a week, she was able to come back with a complete tableau of the family and had contacted a cousin who lived in Maine. Sadly, the family thought that she had gone missing but somehow was still alive. Of course, that's not the case. The suspect in question, who's been identified as well, died several years ago, so he will not be facing justice. As we've talked about on the podcast, Kristin, I also think that for family members who've lost loved ones, just having answers is very meaningful, even if there's no trial and no one's going to be, quote-unquote, brought to justice. I still think this has great value for the community. people that were impacted by this in terms of Anita Pato's friends and family. They talked about, in the news coverage, generations of detectives in Huntington Beach and the Orange County Sheriff's Department who had worked this case. And you to think about it, over 50 years. It's amazing. Kudos to them for sticking with this. All of those investigators, and to Colleen Fitzpatrick and her team for finally helping put this one across the finish line.
We did include a link to Colleen Fitzpatrick's book about forensic genealogy on our social media pages. So if you are interested in taking a look at Colleen's work, feel free to check out that link. It does link you to the Amazon page for that book. It is very interesting.
And easy to remember. The title is Forensic Genealogy.
Short, sweet, and to the point.
Speaking of, I think that's it for now. So I think we're ready to dive into it.
Let's go ahead and get into it with our guest, Rock Harmon. Thank you so much for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas. Joining us today is DNA expert Rock Harmon, who sounds like a superhero and probably is one. Rock, we'd like to say welcome to Mind Over Murder.
Well, thanks for having me.
So let's get into it a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your background, Rock.
I'll start with recent to past. I retired in 2007 after 33 years as a prosecutor in Alameda County, California. It just happened that I got involved in the scientific blood typing field before DNA evidence came along in the early to mid 80s. And by the late 80s, people were talking about DNA evidence. So I had a part in many of the things that happened from the beginning, even up to the time I retired in 2007, including being one of the prosecutors presenting DNA evidence in the OJ Simpson case. I have a historical perspective on it that I think not many people have. I went to the University of San Francisco Law School, graduated in 74. I went to the United States Naval Academy, graduated in 67, served 4 years, including a year on a swift boat in Vietnam and the Mekong Delta. So that's pretty much my adult life right there.
So what made you decide that you wanted to follow a career in law?
Well, I'd been in the Navy. I realized that I needed some other field to develop in. So I applied to law schools after I came back from Vietnam. And as I was finishing law school, my brother was a prosecutor in the Manhattan DA's office. He's a West Point grad. So it just seemed to me that, we were both cut out to do something like he was doing. And he actually helped me get my foot in the door in Alameda County where I work. And it was that's why I was able to stay for 33 years, because it fit me and I fit it.
As a Navy junior, I need to jump in here with this. So wait a minute. Your brother went to West Point and you went to the Naval Academy? Who'd you root for on Army-Navy Day?
Yeah, one of these days I need to dig out the pictures of us at the 50-yard line after the Army-Navy game.
Wow.
We only had those 2-year overlap, because you graduated in 65. No, and those were exciting times, and I realize now how good my parents felt.
Oh, I can imagine. They had to be incredibly proud of you guys.
Yeah, and both of us served in the height of the Vietnam era, so my brother was in the 1st Cavalry Division.
Wow. And you were on swift boats, which was also in the heat of the action.
Yep, and not like the 1st Cavalry Division. We could take showers every day. Unfortunately, the water was pumped up from the Mekong River, and so our doctor gave me Fisahex to take a shower with every day to scrub off whatever I was putting on me from the river.
Not exactly the most luxurious accommodations you've ever had.
Right.
And did you grow up in New York? Am I correct?
Yeah, I grew up on the Upper West Side, right around the corner from the Museum of Natural History. I went to a really good Catholic Jesuit boys high school, Xavier High School on West 16th Street. Still there, still cranking out good citizens.
I know it well. I used to ride my bicycle past it every single day on my way to work during the 14 years I worked for ASCAP across the street from Lincoln Center. So I would ride right past there.
Oh, sure.
How did you get involved in forensics, Rock?
Well, I was assigned a triple murder case. And I think the murders were actually in 1979. It was a man and his wife and his sister were murdered. And they were LSD entrepreneurs. In other words, they would commission a manufacturer of a whole huge bulk amount of LSD. This was California in the LSD era. Anyway, they ended up being murdered, and the investigation focused on a friend of his, and it turned out there were some blood drops from where the bodies were found up the stairs to get out of the house, and they were key to prosecuting the case. And in the DNA era, it would be a slam dunk. In those days, if you got a number like 1 in 100 out of a blood stain, that was a home run. So we had a lot of admissibility litigation in order to try and convict the guy. And because that sort of stuff had been popping up around the country, when I had a good admissibility hearing result in a trial outcome and an appellate decision establishing the legal precedent, to my surprise, it was a big deal around the country because other people were encountering the same problems. So my case helped resolve that. By then, that was about 1987, and that just happened to be when the seminal forensic DNA meeting happened at Cold Spring Harbor in Long Island, and I was there. So it was just one of those things.
Talk to us a little bit about your involvement with the Grim Sleeper case, particularly the use of familial DNA to identify Lonnie Franklin Jr. We've been covering that case here in quite some depth, and we're very interested in your involvement in it.
Sure. In the last couple of years as a prosecutor, I became interested in familial searching and started to learn about it, and then started asking questions in California about why it wasn't being done. And the answers were not really very satisfactory. So we had a forensic committee in California that I was the chair of, the DA. It's a DA committee. And we took it upon ourselves to engage in some high-level meetings with the state about this, and they culminated in then Attorney General Jerry Brown saying, do it, to the state. It was a long, drawn-out series of arguments with them before that led to that. But ultimately, once we understood what their issues were, we were able to address it. That's critical. Very few states have had that kind of conversation. So by that time, I was almost retired, and the State Department of Justice offered me a consulting contract to work with them to develop the protocol. So it was a year contract, and my contract expired just before the Lonnie Franklin success.
And are those protocols followed to this day in terms of familial DNA testing?
It's not rocket science, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there really are very few variables about how to do it. The key is to get people to have the will to do it, to decide to do it. And, as we'll discuss with CODIS, there's too much mystique about what's happening and what's not happening that people, I've coined a phrase, can't means won't. And too often people accept can't without understanding why somebody can't do something when really they don't want to. And the reality is that's why, as you probably know, if you have all these conversations, about less than a third, or fewer than a third of the states are using familial searching, which has proven to be a pretty good tool, another supplement to CODIS itself.
So why aren't more states using familial DNA? I mean, it sounds like an excellent tool. Why the reluctance to use it?
Until you force the kind of conversations that we had with California, you don't know. As I said, can't means won't. I've had opportunities to speak to a number of different entities in many different states around the country, and I've yet to hear a concrete, valid reason why a state, other than, there's two exceptions, other than Maryland, which has a law that precludes them from doing it, and Washington, D.C., which has some kind of rule or regulation. I think what's interesting about both of those entities is they passed those rules or that legislation before anybody was doing it. So it was a preemptive strike. Nobody ever got to sit down with them and say, here's how it works. Do you still think we shouldn't be doing it?
I've always been struck. My family lived in Annapolis several times. As a matter of fact, my older brother, who's a former Navy doctor, lives there now and has for a number of years. What was driving Maryland and D.C.'s concerns if they weren't even using familial DNA?
Great question. You know how the legislature works. It's not something that I'd rather watch sausage be made than watch the legislature butcher some issue, because most of the trade-offs are done in the back room.
Yeah, kind of a disaster.
Or with phone calls ahead of time saying, don't bother. I was able to obtain the only document that spoke in opposition to familial searching in Maryland, and there's no substance to it. There's absolutely nothing there. The state never spoke in opposition to the specific legislation, because the reality, as you know, that there are many trade-offs that occur either in open session or behind closed doors. And what I learned was, Martin O'Malley is. He was a potential presidential candidate. There was a bill to expand the database law, and one of the trade-offs was that the law would be expanded to allow for arrestees, but with the explicit prohibition against doing familial DNA searching.
And who was pushing this other perspective? In other words, I find it interesting that arrestees end up in the DNA base in some localities, and yet, as I know we'll get into, there are serious criminals whose DNA is not in the CODIS system.
Yeah.
But who is pushing this trade-off? Do you have any sense of that?
No, I think the better way to pose the question is who accepted it?
No, you're right, actually. That is a good question. So,
because you have a big step forward, and because it wasn't being done then, a trivial concession. It turns out to be, I think, a substantial concession. But if nobody spoke in opposition to it, it's easy.
Well, I mean, I did public affairs and legislative work for a number of years for ASCAP, the songwriters organization.
Sure.
And I've spent a tremendous amount of time in Washington and in Congress and meeting with senators and congresspeople, as well as traveling around the country, including to Annapolis, to discuss legislation. I don't know how to say this in any other way except a fairly unvarnished way. As bad as Congress can be, it is so much worse at the state level. I have never seen a bigger group of hacks than state legislatures around the country. And I was there. I mean, I heard just unbelievably unsophisticated thinking on both sides of the aisle. This isn't, Republicans versus Democrats, and I'm not trying to open up a political discussion at all. Uninformed, lobbyist-driven drivel just moving forward as a result of political connections. And it's funny, I was kind of pushing there. You never quite understood why decisions were being made, and they were not being made in a thoughtful way at all. And there was very little focus on what is good for the people of whatever state we happen to be in. I could go on for hours with the horror stories just on copyright that we saw both at the federal level, but especially at the state level. It is frightening what goes on in state houses around the country.
Here's a little perspective. 1989, I'm in Sacramento to testify in support of we already had a law that required sex offenders to give samples before DNA. We'll just leave it at that. So our DNA law really was an amendment of that to make it be DNA. And we were there all day long, okay? And nobody knew how important it was then because we were just starting to have our first cases then. And we waited and waited all day, and the session went into the night, and we were the next to the last bill call. The one before us got all sorts of attention because you remember who Amanda Blake was? Miss Kitty?
Oh, sure.
She believed that elephants were being abused and by circuses and stuff. They got more time than we did because it was Miss Kitty. So that was one of my first experiences with the legislature. I thought, wow, I know it has to happen this way, but boy, I'll never forget that experience.
We found the same thing when I was with ASCAP, by the way. You know, we represented songwriters, composers, and music publishers. And boy, if you wanted to get some attention for your legislation, and I will be honest, we did play this card any number of times. If you want to bring attention to your bill, you bring down Roberta Flack or Garth Brooks, United States senators, including a lot of people that are still household names, stood in line to meet Garth Brooks, Billy Joel, Judy Collins. It was amazing how if you played that star card, you could get so much more attention for your little piece of legislation, whatever it was.
So, Rock, you've been one of the leading voices pointing out the problems in the CODIS system, particularly with inmates in prisons not being in the CODIS system. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Give us, some idea of how big the CODIS gap actually is.
If I don't, I'm going to give you a long answer. I'm going to actually give you a step way back from that. So if I don't get back around to it, remind me of that when I'm done. CODIS solves cases. And I remember the excitement I felt when in California we first started with our state database. And so CODIS, just imagine before we had the DNA database, the police would either solve the crime through the investigation or not. And so when CODIS came along, it provided additional hope that if there was material DNA there, we might match it to somebody in the database. So clearly it's done that. And people want to debate how effective it is. I say it solves a crime, and I'm saying solving a crime, not just providing information, maybe a third of the time, ever, okay? And so that's a third more than we ever had before CODIS. Since then, we've added familial DNA searching in about a third of the states, and then more recently, we've added genetic genealogy to it. So now we have CODIS as a possibility of solving crimes. We have familial searching as a possibility of solving crimes. We have genetic genealogy as a possibility of solving crimes. Well, both familial searching successes and genetic genealogy successes have, if you open your eyes, make you realize that there are some problems with CODIS. We'll talk about some of these. I know I gave you some of these stories. So when I first got my first CODIS hit, I realized it provided insight into how well CODIS is doing. There's a simple question that I started asking. And the question was, why did this happen now? And if the answer is everything worked the way it should to solve the crime now, then that's great. That's a healthy report on it. If the answer is, Well, the guy's sample wasn't collected the first time he got arrested for rape, or the second time he got arrested for rape, or the first time he went to prison, or the second time he went to prison, then that reflects a problem that needs to be addressed and solved. And the same with genealogy. We'll talk about those cases on the Texas death row inmates, where you say, this genealogy stuff is fantastic. It seems to be as effective as CODIS or more. And the point of, to me, asking these questions or going through this analysis every time is, okay, you celebrate solving the case, but there's a bigger picture there, and that is, are the systems that we have working the way they were designed to? And so, for example, if we could fix the problems that exist in CODIS by perhaps thousands, tens of thousands of inmates who should be in there not being in there, then that would leave fewer cases for familial searching or genetic genealogy. And we could really ramp up our approaches to those cases. But if now we just have a genealogy success that everybody celebrates and people don't, critically evaluate what happened, we're still going to have, when I looked this morning, there's about 500,000 unsolved DNA profiles in CODIS.
One of the most frequent questions we're asked here at Mind Over Murder is, how can I help?
Thanks to Othram, a leading forensic DNA testing lab for law enforcement, you can get involved and help solve real cases.
If you have tested at a consumer genetics company, you can contribute your data to DNAsolves.com. The process is easy and confidential, just 2 simple steps. Your DNA might be the missing piece that helps solve the identity of an unknown person.
Then Mind Over Murder will highlight cases Othram is working on to seek your crowdfunding support for DNA testing to help solve these cold cases.
Upload your DNA profile to DNAsolves.com. It's easy, free, and confidential.
Then join Mind Over Murder as we help families find answers with Othram and DNAsolves.com. Do you like our show, Mind Over Murder, and want to create your own podcast?
Well then, let us tell you about Anchor.
First of all, it's free. And who doesn't love free, right?
I like free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer.
You can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before.
Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more platforms.
And you can even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership.
I like the sound of that. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Right here, Anchor.
Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your own podcast.
You can tell them Kristin and Bill from Mind Over Murder sent you.
So if CODIS could be solving 10% of them, 20% of them, 30% of them, at least fewer for familial searching or genetic genealogy. Because if you look at the history of genealogy in the U.S., they're just cherry-picking cases. I'm not being critical of it. I think it's great that they're solving these cases that have been unsolved for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. But if they could be picked off by CODIS, then you could develop a more systematic approach because it's a much smaller number of target cases. The way cases are selected for genealogy, they're purely random. So if we could really whittle down the number of cases and use those other 2 systems, then I think we'd have a lot more success. And so if, I know you've seen the materials I sent. So if you have, maybe you need to understand a little bit more about how our laws evolve. I mentioned 1989 California. If California and Virginia were, I can't be certain about this, but I'm pretty sure they were among the only states to pass their laws so early, at the earliest possible moment, because we were just really starting to use DNA. Our first cases in Alameda County were 89 and 90. So we said, okay, we're going to have our database too, or we want to have our database. We want to start cranking these out. So we passed our law back then. Most or many states waited until 94, 95. And they did that. Apparently, I wasn't involved in any of those discussions. I was kind of surprised when I realized this. That's the first time that the FBI DNA Identification Act was passed, enabling constructing, I'll call it a national database, but it's really a network of state databases that was overseen by the FBI. And unbeknownst to me, there were two issues that haunt us to today that were never really clearly addressed. One of them is the retroactivity of their laws, and the other was whether or not you could force an inmate to provide a sample if he didn't want to. And the damage for not having those two issues clearly addressed persists until through today.
Couldn't this be rectified with a model piece of legislation, either at the federal level or distributed to the states, saying, look, folks, we need to fix this? These two issues, the lack of retroactivity and clarification of whether or not an inmate, a violent offender, can be obligated to give up, I'll say his or her, but we know it's his, DNA. Couldn't this be rectified either at the federal level or at the state level?
Well, you know, the reality is there's no open questions about either of those issues. If you look at what happened in Nevada, or if you look at what happened anywhere, they misinterpreted their own laws on both of those issues. I mean, the legal precedent is very clear. You can force somebody to give a sample as long as you don't use objectionable means. So that was never, but it was I think the separation, because for the most part, it would appear that this is happening at the prison level. So for the most part, and I just have to guess at this, that nobody from law enforcement or prosecution ever asked the prison, hey, what are you doing? Because when Nevada was asked, hey, what are you doing? They just said, oh, yeah, we should have been collecting these thousands of guys all along. And the same with using force. The idea, if you look at a recurrent theme in one of Seth Augustine's Forensic Magazine articles, you could use force. In Nevada, they get a court order when a guy said, I don't want to give it to you. What would you do if you were a serial rapist and you got away with it and you were going to be in prison for another 20 years? You'd say, I don't feel like it.
Right.
And if all you're going to do is get a court order, which takes time, 8,000 times how much time it takes to court order, that's how long it will take them I have no idea if they're still doing it or not. You know, the states that I'll mention and the states that are mentioned in any of those articles, those are the states that have talked about this. Right.
As a matter of fact, some states are refusing to provide this information.
Absolutely.
Which is ridiculous. By the way, for the benefit of our listeners, Rock, we're talking about a test that doesn't hurt. It's not invasive. We're talking about the little oral swab that's inserted into your mouth for about 10 seconds or so. I've had it done by the FBI as part of my sister's case, the Colonial Parkway murders investigation, as have my brothers, for elimination purposes. But I certainly had no problem with it, and it's not an unpleasant experience. I've had much worse experiences at the dentist.
Sure.
To be frank, you know, it doesn't hurt. You don't need to be strapped down to a gurney to have somebody put a swab in your mouth.
It's a lot easier than the COVID nasal test.
Oh yeah, just had that done the other day. It wasn't.
I still haven't done. Huh? I still feel good, so I'm holding out here.
Well, I had to go in for a routine medical procedure, and I had to have the COVID test. By the way, the new COVID test is much less intrusive. They don't stick it quite so far up your nostril.
Yeah.
About 10 seconds per side. I asked the nurse, does it hurt? She laughed. Probably sounded like a little kid. It was fine. And it would probably be equivalent, the oral swab for the DNA thing. It's really not bad. And we're not talking about doing something horrible to America's violent offenders.
There was another point in history that it just probably fits right in the middle of what I was saying. In many states, including California, and I can't quantify it now, maybe you know the answer to this, we have evolved to collect from all felony arrestees. So at least as far as that, if you're in that kind of state, prospectively, from whenever that law changed, this should not be an issue unless it applies to that glut of people who have been in there for 10, 20, 30 years. But if you're in one of those states that has not changed their law to require all felony arrestees to provide samples, then this problem almost certainly exists. And it just needs to be addressed. And I sent you those stories from Ohio. Somehow, and I think it's because their then AG, now governor, like transparency in things, they identify a large 15,000 people that should have been in there that weren't in there. So that's rare when the information is provided by somebody in a position of authority. Sadly, somebody has to find out about it, and it, like Seth Augustine, and then start asking questions and filing public record requests to find out the truth.
Ohio is an example of a state you think is doing it right. Am I understanding you correctly?
Well, they're finally doing it right somehow, and to their credit, it did. I don't know. I don't think it came from some expose article. They announced, this was a couple of years ago, that 15,000 offenders were missing. I don't know how or what triggered that. And then they set out to collect from all of them.
It's a step in the right direction anyway.
Totally. Transparency, it always is, yeah.
Can you talk to us about Nevada and what happened there with the Ewing case?
I don't remember names. Is that the hammer killer guy?
That's correct. The Aurora hammer killer, as the press referred to him.
Let me just back up a little bit. And part of this is in one of those stories I sent you. A few years ago, I mentioned being the chair of a forensic evidence committee. So sometimes prosecutors, some of the old timers who were there when I was there, would ask me to sit in on it because they're going to talk about something that I might help them with. And so we had a conversation one time about the Golden State Killer. And I knew that Nevada had a problem because I saw another case break, and I sent you some of the stories, the Gypsy Hill Killer break, where they identified a killer of two young women who'd been in CODIS. Their evidence profiles have been in CODIS for decades. It just seemed unusual that somebody could be undetected for so long. It turned out that inmate had been in Nevada State Prison. His history was very, very complicated, but he was in Nevada State Prison for, I can't remember, 15, 18 years without having his sample collected. When his term was up there, he was sent back to Oregon. In Oregon, doing their job the way they should, looked at him and said, look, this is the kind of guy, for the crime we have him for, and also for the crimes that Nevada had him for, that we need to collect a sample. It was Oregon collecting the sample on this guy who'd been in Nevada prison for a long time, that suddenly identified him as the killer of these two girls whose profiles had been in CODIS for a long time. It was clear from that experience that Nevada was not interpreting their laws retroactively. So we were discussing this in the context of the Golden State Killer, and I suggested that the guy could be, this is before genealogy solved the case, that the killer could be in Nevada State Prison, because I'd seen this before with him, that they were misinterpreting their own law. To make a long story short, one of the DAs wrote a letter to the local prosecutor where the DNA CODIS lab exists in Washoe County. He proposed a review of their existing law. They decided that they didn't quite say it this way, but they hadn't been applying their law retroactively. They identified about 8,000 people whose cases, who should have been in the database, suddenly decided to start collecting them. They used court orders because once the word gets out in prison that if you say no, that may prevent them from ever collecting or make it harder. Ultimately, these Colorado Harmon murder cases miraculously get solved on an inmate that had been in prison in Nevada since shortly after the Colorado Harmon murders occurred. And they solve those. That just provides some insight into the damage by not collecting from dangerous inmates who are covered by your existing law.
I mean, when you first told me this some months back, Rock, I had a hard time not falling out of my chair. So what you're saying is there are rapists and murderers, convicted, violent offenders, sometimes multiple offenders, whose DNA has never been tested, and they're not in the CODIS system to this day.
I can't say to this day. That's a question that Seth was good at getting answers like that.
Right. This is Seth Augustine from Forensic Magazine.
Yeah, but I can tell you this. It seems clear from the Harmon murder case and perhaps any other case that fell into this category that suddenly got solved, that they're not going to say, this is when we screwed up and we finally got it right. That's not going to be, Ohio might be more forthcoming on that.
Well, I have said in many interviews, and I'll say again here, that in the Colonial Parkway murders, and I can only use personal experience here, institutional interests always supersede investigative interests. So, Unfortunately, states, prison authorities, law enforcement, I mean, I'm just dealing with what we've dealt with so far in the 33 years since my sister was murdered. These institutions are much more concerned with not looking bad than in getting to the root of a problem. And for the benefit of our listeners, we'll include links to all of these wonderful stories that you sent us, which are very disturbing. Seth Augustine from Forensics Magazine made inquiries to all of the states, and some of these states refused to answer the question and still refuse to answer the question, are the inmates in your state prison system currently up to date in terms of DNA testing? I'll go out on a limb here that many of them are not in the CODIS system based on conversations with you and other people.
Sure. But you're absolutely right on the institutional part of it. But, here's how I felt. Where's law enforcement on any of this? Where are the prosecutors on any of this? They're the ones that put these inmates in a position where they're supposed to provide a DNA sample. They're the ones that convicted them. They're the ones that dealt with victim survivors and all the rest of that. Yet there seems to be no curiosity on their part to make sure that this other entity, the prison system or probation or parole or any of those other entities, that they do what they're supposed to do. You would think that, I'm sure we'll talk about the Texas death row inmates in a little bit. You would think there would be outrage to find out. But all this could be prevented by having some sort of oversight or interaction with them. I'll give you an example. In our early days of our law, our DOJ lab always invited me to meetings because I was interested in it. So it became clear that by this time, it's probably 95, 96, after OJ, when we really started picking things up, I was curious about lifers, under our law. Clearly, they were mandated. So I got one of our computer people to get me a list of 20 years of people convicted from Alameda County. I gave it to the GOJ lab and said, okay, how many of these people are in CODIS already? Because by now, our law's been in place for 5, 6 years. And it turned out that a small, maybe 20, 30, 40%, I don't remember the exact number. Next time we had a meeting with the Department of Corrections, I brought this up. And they said, that's a good question. We've interpreted our law to collect from the people just before they get out. And I said, and if you never get out, you don't get into the database. And they said, I guess you're right. So what we did? We had to explicitly change our law to require it to be done on the way in rather than on the way out. But if you weren't curious about it, just to make sure that people weren't doing something stupid, then you'd end up 10, 15, 20 years later, like Nevada did, or like Ohio did. Say, oh gosh, look at the problem. The failure to do this has real ramifications. We recently, I say we because my only job was with Alameda County, had a hit on an old murder case from Oakland that has been in CODIS for 20 years. So you remember, my curiosity test is, why did this happen now? I was able to learn, guess where the guy had been for 20 years? Nevada State Prison. And because this case was already years old when we got it into CODIS, it's probably a 38-year-old murder case. Well, you have problem finding people still alive or competent to be able to prosecute a case. So getting a hit on it, that's the start. It's not the end. You have to be able to prove it. And so these delays like this really can have severe impact on the outcome. The final outcome is not a hit. The final outcome is accountability to the legal system.
I'll add one other thing, Rock, from the perspective of the brother of a murder victim. And this, I'd be happy to sit down with the nation's prosecutors to talk about this. There are at least 200,000 cold case murders in the United States currently, and I think that number's low. And I think there are at least that number of rapes and sexual assaults. So that may line up with your 500,000 number that you saw in CODIS in terms of unsolved cases overall. Everybody's a specialist in our world, and prosecutors, I understand, have a job to do. But what they're failing to understand is that there are hundreds of thousands of family members who go to sleep every single night wondering what happened to their loved one, whether they were raped, sexually assaulted, murdered, what have you, that are looking for answers. We understand that in many examples, if the perpetrator, the offender, is already incarcerated or dead or what have you, that there isn't going to be a trial. But that for people who are waiting for answers, for the system to allow these people to wait the rest of their lives for answers, it's unconscionable. In other words, at least if the perpetrators were identified and people were told your loved one was, we believe he or she was attacked by so-and-so, who's currently incarcerated or may have passed away or what have you, at least we have answers. It isn't just about prosecution. Sure. It's about seeking some measure of justice. In the example that you brought up in Alameda County, where they weren't even testing the inmates unless they were getting out of jail, they've gotten themselves into a mindset that says that knowing that this offender may have offended 4, 5, a dozen additional times wasn't meaningful to the community, and I'm here to tell you that it is.
let me give you another instance of having meetings with these entities. I mean, if you just say, okay, you people over there have to do it, and you never interact with them ever again, what you see in Nevada, what you see in Ohio is what happened. In one of our subsequent sessions with the Department of Corrections, as we were trying to make sure everybody understood what was required and made sure we had a means to check on them and things, the question of using force came up because, as I said, legal precedent is very clear that you can use force to collect samples. So there was never a question in our minds that they would until we asked at one of the subsequent meetings. And it turned out that while they understood what legal precedent said, they wrote an internal regulation that explicitly precluded the use of force. And I sarcastically call them, they're like the Leona Helmsley of the justice system. They want everybody to get along. I mean, and you kind of understand that, okay? You don't want to raise tension in prison anymore, but to find out that they had deliberately undermined legal precedent and hadn't told us about that. So what we did? We made our law explicit.
Right.
And which we shouldn't have had to do. But instead of getting into a pissing contest with them about which trumped what, that's what we did. And presumably they implemented. But I guarantee you very few states had that kind of interaction as things were developing.
Join us again next time as we continue our conversation with DNA expert Rock Harmon, discussing what we've come to call the CODIS Gap. Why are thousands of inmates and now paroled felons not in the CODIS system? Join us again next time on Mind Over Murder.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.